Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Álvaro Santos, professor at law at Georgetown University and faculty director of CAROLA, the Center for the Advancement of the Rule of Law in the Americas. Welcome to the second webinar of our fall series, The Americas in Times of COVID-19. We have called today's session The Future of Trade, and we have a wonderful lineup of speakers who I'll introduce in a moment. In this session, we plan to discuss what the future may hold for the international trade regime based on important developments, such as the NAFTA renegotiation and the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA, that came out of that effort, the trade wars between the US and China, the efforts to reform the WTO, and particularly its dispute settlement system, and the concerns with the distributional consequences or welfare effects of international trade law and policy. It seems that we are at a pivotal moment, a moment of backlash against globalization, where the assumptions about international trade and the international trade agreements built on those assumptions have been seriously challenged. This moment may also present an important opportunity to redesign trade policy at the national, bilateral, and multilateral level to address some of those concerns that have given rise to the backlash. So we have invited speakers with deep knowledge and experience in international trade who bring also different perspectives about why we are seeing a backlash and about how the future could or should look like. We're very grateful to our speakers and really delighted to have their insights. I will introduce them in the order that they will speak. So first, we have Ambassador James Jones, who is the chairman of Monarch Global Strategies. His practice focuses on international trade, investment and commerce, business-government relations, and financial services. He has worked extensively with a wide range of US businesses seeking to enter or already operating in Mexico, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. He is a former United States ambassador to Mexico and member of the US House of Representatives. Ambassador Jones participated in the negotiation, passage, and implementation of NAFTA. He also helped formulate the United States government's rescue package for Mexico during the 1994 peso crisis, which prevented bankruptcy of the Mexican government. Ambassador Jones's previous business experience includes his service as chairman and CEO of the American Stock Exchange, AMEX, in New York. During his tenure at AMEX, listings, revenue, and market share increased. He was also president of Warnaco International in New York. Ambassador Jones's public service career began at the White House at age 25. At age 28, he became President Lyndon Johnson's final chief of staff. He was also a member of Congress for 14 years, where he was chairman of the Budget Committee and a ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee. We're also very proud at Georgetown that Ambassador Jones is an alum of Georgetown Law. Next, we have Mark Wu, who is Henry Stimson Professor and the Vice Dean for the Graduate Program and International Legal Studies at Harvard Law School. He conducts research on international trade and international economic law, and his writings cover a range of topics, including the impact of emerging economies on global governance, digital technologies, trade remedies, environment, and foreign investment. Professor Wu serves on the advisory board of the World Trade Organization Chairs Program, and he's also a principal liaison to the Trade and Environment Policy Advisory Committee. Prior to academia, Wu served as the Director for Intellectual Property in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. In that role, he led the negotiations for the IP chapter of several free trade negotiations and oversaw the Special 301 process. Before government, he worked as a management consultant at McKinsey & Company. He began his career as an economist and operations officer at World Bank in China. He also served as a law clerk to Judge Pierre Leval of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. For his teaching, Professor Wu has been honored with the Sachs-Freund Award and the HLS Student Government Teaching and Advising Award, both of which he received while still a junior faculty member. To date, he is the only recipient of both awards. Next, we will have Lori Wallach, who is the Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. A 25-year veteran of congressional trade battles, starting with the 1990s fight over NAFTA, she was named to the Politico's 50 list of thinkers, doers, and visionaries transforming American politics in 2016 for her leadership in the Trans-Pacific Partnership debate. Wallach is an internationally recognized expert on trade with experience advocating in Congress and foreign parliaments, trade negotiations, courts, government agencies, the media, and in the streets. Dubbed the trade debate guerrillas warrior in a National Journal profile and Ralph Nader with a sense of humor in a Wall Street Journal profile, she combines a lawyer's expertise on the terms and outcomes of agreements with insight from the front lines of trade debates. Wallach's specialty is translating arcane trade issues into accessible language. Wallach has testified on NAFTA, WTO, and other globalization issues before 30 congressional committees and appeared as a trade commentator on numerous media outlets. Books she has written on trade include The Rise and Fall of Fast Track Authority and Whose Trade Organization, a comprehensive guide to the WTO, and she has contributed to numerous anthologies. Wallach was a founder of the Citizens Trade Campaign, a U.S. national coalition of consumer, labor, environmental, family farm, religious, and civil rights groups, representing over 11 million Americans, and serves on its board. And finally, we'll have Harlan Grant Cohen, who holds the Gabriel M. Wilner UGA Foundation Professorship in International Law, and serves as a faculty co-director of the law school's Dean Rusk International Law Center at the University of Georgia School of Law. His international law scholarship has appeared in the American Journal of International Law, the law reviews of George Washington, Tulane, Iowa, and New York University, as well as the Yale, Berkeley, NYU, and Michigan Journals of International Law. Cohen is a member of the Board of Editors of the American Journal of International Law and a member of the American Law Institute. He has served as a member of the Executive Council of the American Society of International Law and as co-chair of the Society's 106th annual meeting. He currently serves as chair of the American Society of International Law's International Legal Theory Interest Group. Before entering the academy, he worked at the law firm Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen & Hamilton and served as a judicial clerk for Judge Wilfred Feinberg of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. So as you can see, we have a wonderful lineup of speakers, and now I will turn the mic to them, but I also want to let the audience know that after they finish speaking, we'll turn to Q&A, and for that, you have a button at the bottom of your Zoom window where you can write questions that then I will pose to the panelists. So when you write a question, please identify yourself and affiliation, and also indicate whether you want to direct a question to a specific panelist. So without further ado, Ambassador Jones, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alvaro. It's a pleasure to be with such a distinguished panel. As I said earlier, I'm a bit intimidated by them, but we'll do our best. This particular discussion comes at an inflection point, in my judgment, both in trade policy and international policy in general. We are an inward-looking country right now. After the Trump election in 2016, there were many more traditional politicians who were shocked at his victory. And a lot of studies were done by think tanks, by schools, by politicians themselves to try to understand who these 38 to 40% hardcore supporters of Trump were. Obviously, most of them were white males, but what drove them? The studies showed a number of things. Number one, that politicians were talking down to this particular group, and they got tired of that. Number two, that they were not being listened to. And number three, that they were being disadvantaged as middle-class folks, disadvantaged by the laws that have been passed, particularly in the international realm. This is very different than what I grew up in the post-World War II era, where we were 5% of the world's population and controlled or had 30+% of the world's wealth. It's a much different story today. And then we were magnanimous. We were rebuilding our former allies as well as our opponents. We were creating institutions. We were opening markets. We were doing all the things that were good for the world, but also good for the United States. The battles when I was at the White House and afterwards were between protectionists and free traders. Then NAFTA came along, and it was a advance in trade policy. Things were included that were not included before. And those who opposed NAFTA going through, most notably the Teamsters Union and others who were opposed to it, continued to be opposed to it after it was passed. And those who were for it basically just did their business and didn't promote it as they had before. And so NAFTA became sort of the poster boy for things that were bad and were harmful to working Americans. And then came along Trump, and the concern there was he was so against trade that he was going to basically get rid of NAFTA and not particularly have anything else in its place. And we're moving toward a set of bilaterals on trade policy. So that brings us to where we are today. You'll notice in USMCA, there's no word in the title about free trade, which was unlike the different negotiated agreements in the past several years. It's the US-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement. Agreement, no free trade. And that stands out in the number of the provisions. The auto provision, for example, is much more protectionist, much more difficult to understand than anything we had had before that. The good parts about the USMCA were on labor. I think it gives labor a chance to file its grievances, discuss and get remedies than it had before. There were other parts that were very good, but it is a fundamental change in the way we look at trade agreements. And I think that's going to be with us for a while, whether Trump wins or doesn't win this year. On the auto section, let me just mention, I do think that is going to be a difficult thing to implement. It is very, very difficult to understand and to prevent some cheating going on. But it will, and those who have studied the thing as to whether it's good or bad for the United States, I come out that it's about even. Well, some of I think the International Trade Commission had the United States increasing jobs marginally, and Mexico losing, and Canada losing jobs marginally. I think it comes out to about even, but it is a different realm, and I think we just have to get accustomed to it. Let me stop there, and I'll look forward to having questions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jones. Let me now turn to Mark, who we've asked to talk about the US-China ongoing trade wars and what these may look not only for these two countries, but also for the trade regime more generally.
Thank you very much, Alvaro, and thank you for having me here today. It's a real honor to be here with such a distinguished set of panelists, but also to be with you, at least virtually, at Georgetown Law. You all put on a terrific series of events for the public in general in terms of thinking about trade, and particularly the work that you and others are doing at CAROLA in terms of thinking about how trade then fits into a larger social context that can be more inclusive, where the benefits extend beyond. Just again, it's a real pleasure to be here. I was asked to speak about the US-China trade war, and particularly what this might mean for Latin America in the context of the future of trade going forward, as well as in the specific COVID-19 pandemic situation that we're facing. I think it goes to say without a doubt that like much of the rest of the world, Latin America finds itself subject to increased whiplash as a result of the geopolitical tensions that are ongoing between US and China. I personally think those will be with us for a while, and they'll be somewhat unpredictable to fathom, or at least to plan in when those tensions will ebb and flow. But one big question mark that we face before us, of course, is the November elections and the specific context in which the phase one trade agreement, which has provided a temporary truce for the last several months, whether that will hold. And I think one thing that behooves everyone to take note of are the specific procurement requirements of that agreement, and the fact that at least as of right now, the procurement arrangements are lagging behind what is required as part of that agreement for 2020. That means there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the ensuing months in order to catch up and to meet that target. And I think one big question mark will be, if that target is not met, what that will mean in terms of whether or not the trade war will escalate. But so let me double click on this and touch a little bit on this a little bit more specifically in the Latin American context. So we have two possible scenarios. One, of course, is the Chinese do amp up their purchases in forthcoming months. That will particularly be with regards to Latin America on the agricultural side, where Latin American countries compete with US in certain goods, particularly soybeans and the like, but also beef and other products, where the Chinese have shifted towards Latin American suppliers away from US suppliers. If those purchases go up in the near term in order to meet the phase one trade agreement requirements, this will have a negative short-term shock at Latin America, particularly in the export sector, at a time when these economies are facing already an economic shock from COVID-19. So that's one possible scenario. The other possible scenario, of course, is that the Chinese don't meet those purchase requirement commitments, and then we may see again an escalation in tensions between the US and China as a result of that. It's hard to think through how either if President Trump or President Biden were to face that type of situation, how they could not escalate in that type of context and appear to look soft on the phase one trade agreement. That would throw a different set of Latin American industries in disarray. So what I'm trying to say here is, with regards to the phase one trade agreement and the specific context of next couple of months, some group within Latin America is going to face some negative repercussions, but it's unclear as to who that will be. So having started out on a fairly negative note, let me then touch on one other context where I think the US-China geopolitical tensions is going to have another set of choices that face a set of negative repercussions for Latin America. And that's in the technology realm, and the fact that many Latin American economies are seeking to upgrade their ICT infrastructure and to make sure that they remain competitive in the digital era ahead. And I think we can look at Latin America as one market that has been successful, whether through Mercado Libre or other startups, in really developing its own regional digital ecosystem. But what this has meant is, whereas one might have hoped that this ecosystem could both integrate with the Chinese and the American ecosystems, the ensuing trade war between the two, and particularly the technological component of this, will mean that Latin America will either need to, design two different systems in order to integrate with the Chinese-facing elements as well as the US-facing elements, or alternatively, if it can't afford to do so, if it needs to purchase one set of physical infrastructure commitments, think through very, very carefully who it chooses to purchase from, because the other side will view with some suspicion as to how that physical infrastructure, in terms of how the pipes, the servers, the routers, and so forth, are all laid out. So all of this, again, means, right, that Latin America is again subject to a set of whiplash. Unlike the first set of factors that I discussed, this set of factors is completely within the control of governments, but governments will have to make some very hard-edged choices of whether it wishes to procure arguably cheaper Chinese ICT products at the risk of some type of internet implications with the United States, or to purchase more expensive US-based products, align itself with the US, but possibly face some negative repercussions with the fast-growing markets in Asia, or to build out dual systems, which will be expensive. I think with regards to Latin American firms, this will help the large platform players who will certainly have the funds in order to integrate with both sides, but it will raise the cost for startups in Latin America that in a world 5 years ago could have proceeded, assuming it could tap into both markets, but now we'll have to have more design costs in terms of thinking through how to deal with both ecosystems. So this, again, is a negative implication for Latin America coming out from the US-China trade war, but specific to the technology front, where we arguably have the least amount of rules to be able to deal with it, unlike at least with regards to some of the other areas. The last part that I want to touch on, though, is where opportunities for Latin America might exist. And the opportunities come as a result of the trade war. A fancy term that everyone likes to talk about in vogue these days is decoupling. But I think if we look at what's really happening, well, decoupling is occurring with regards to certain sectors. Those are not necessarily sectors where Latin America is a major player in terms of an alternative, right, to Chinese or to American suppliers, unlike in the agricultural realm. But much of what we see happening in most other industries, right, where it's not a pure decoupling, what we are seeing is supply chain diversification. In other words, firms are choosing to not bet exclusively on procuring from either Asia itself or from the US itself in order to serve the other market because of the increased tariffs that we're seeing across the Pacific, particularly between the US and China. And here, I think Latin America has an opportunity to position itself as firms start to diversify in its supply chain, to position itself to be one of these alternative suppliers. And here is where the types of trade agreements that countries will have with both the US and China, and particularly these construed rules of origin, present an opportunity. But let me point out two things here that I think are of particular importance to Latin America. On the US side, regardless of who prevails in November, it's clear that there are a set of new elements that will find itself in US trade agreements, particularly with regards to labor requirements, that if Latin America is seeking to position itself as an alternative or additional supplier on top of what is being supplied through China, that it needs to make sure that it adheres to those types of labor requirements, even if that's not specifically contained with regards to its present trade arrangements with the US. It's clear the US is moving in that type of direction, and others in the region, including Canada as well. So that's one thing to take note of. The second thing, though, is with regards to supplying the Chinese market. And here, where Latin America is really going to have to look is not so much with regards to China itself, but helping Chinese firms how to think about, as they move outwards, how do they use Latin America as a base to supply non-US markets in the Americas, and what those needs will be. We've seen this with regards to basic raw materials, commodities, but I think there will be more opportunities to tap into that in other realms as well, particularly as the divisions become sharper between the US and China, and it becomes more difficult for Chinese firms to use a US base in order to supply the rest of the Americas. So I think those are just sort of 3 points here to touch on how the U.S.-China trade tensions present a very different reality, both for Latin American governments as well as Latin American firms going forward. The last point that I'll add is in the COVID-19 context, it's clear that everyone is pumping more money into their economies. This is creating liquidity that will have an after effect in currency markets. It's also increasing the amount of subsidies that particular firms will face. All of this will subject Latin America to increased whiplash as well on the currency markets and the financial markets, and possibly with regards to specific sectors that where it will be facing, right, increasingly competitors with soft budget constraints as a result of these subsidies. So thanks very much, and I hope that provides some food for thought about the implications for Latin America from the growing U.S.-China trade tensions.
Thank you very much, Mark, for sharing your perspective on all of these issues. And so now we're going to turn to Lori Wallach, who we've asked to talk about the multilateral trade regime and the changing prospects for the multilateral engagement, particularly also with the reform proposals for changing the dispute settlement system. Lori, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for including me. It's a terrific panel, and I'm honored to have been asked to be included. The first thing I would say is that if I had a clear sense of what the future for the WTO will be, I suspect my crystal ball would be in great demand for other questions of great import at the moment. So I want to start with the caveat that there are so many X factors. I mean, with respect to the politics, the policy, the interplay of other global challenges such as climate, that it is easier to give a lay of the land of what the situation is, how we got there, and then what the range of possible directions are with respect to the WTO, where the enforcement system to some degree, though it is its own problem, the crisis that it is in is also a symptom of the broader crisis right now with the only existing comprehensive set of rules for the global economy that are enforceable. Those are the WTO. So the WTO's current status, I would say, is something like critical but stable, which is to say the actual trade part, which has some legitimacy, the rules, the tariffs, schedules for the member countries, but also the basic principles of non-discrimination, most favored nation status. Those are the market access for trading goods. That's functioning, that's in place. The enforcement regime has been going off kilter for a very long time. And the second Bush administration, the Obama administration, basically all raised the same kinds of issues about the appellate body writing rules not agreed to by the signatory countries, making interpretations that were not necessary to decide cases, et cetera. And the USTR Lighthizer took action, but it's on a set of complaints and concerns that have been for a while. It's probably a good thing that a spanner was thrown in the works to actually force some serious discussion of how to fix that regime as compared to it just going along with a lot of people complaining, countries complaining. So you've got the negotiation function that is totally failed. You've got and more on that in a second, the enforcement function that is currently jammed. And then you have the actual, ironically, stuff that was there before the WTO, which is the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the actual trade in goods across borders. That piece is the piece that actually is functioning currently. So with that as the reality, it's worth thinking about how the hell did that happen? Given the WTO, when it was launched in 1995, was touted as this miraculous new advance in global trade rules. But the reality is, if you think about how it came to be, it was basically born into crisis, a legitimacy crisis. in that a lot of the elements of the Uruguay round GATT negotiation that created the WTO were opposed by many of the then signatory countries, developing countries. But the dynamic of how those negotiations worked allowed the US and Europe to basically jam those rules into place at a take it or leave it basis. And in fact, the Uruguay round ground to a halt for a year. And ultimately, the deal was done in Blair House across the street from the White House with the European and US negotiators locked up, cooked up an ag deal, came back, told the rest of the world, sign here. And suddenly all sorts of issues that had never been part of a trade agreement, sort of also the same scenario that Ambassador Jones mentioned with NAFTA, all kinds of new issues that weren't typically in trade agreements were suddenly part of this global commerce agency, the WTO. And so you have a huge new scope that a lot of countries oppose. Some of the provisions were so controversial that parts of it basically were left as a plurilateral procurement. Other parts were left as a negative list, GATS. A positive list, GATS. You had to volunteer what sectors would be covered. And the IP rules were contested by most of the WTO member countries or developing countries from the start. But also the process was designed in a different worldview, a worldview of the US and the EU, Europe, the European community, then calling the shots. Yet the actual structure was set up to have all countries having certain roles and to have consensus. And so the psychology was the old bully boys psychology, but the structure that was actually designed and agreed gave rights to more countries. And developing countries have used them. And both the ability for blocks of countries, typically when there is at least one or two large developing countries involved, Brazil, South Africa, China now, plus the rise of China, have really shifted the dynamic. And as well, the scope and the content, as well as the process, were of a different mind. And particularly, the scope and the content are premised on a worldview that isn't as prominent. In fact, some would say is on its way to the History Museum. And that is a sort of basket of an agreement, a consensus that a basket of neoliberal policies that extend far beyond trade would be, or at least were sold as, the way forward for prosperity for everyone. The sort of instruments have led us to this model of hyperglobalization, of very long globalized supply chains, global rights for intellectual property and for foreign investors, for the law students. This goes from the investment rules in the WTO, which are not enforceable privately, to the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism and those expansive rights being incorporated in free trade agreements, but also the idea of putting into a free trade agreement or free trade regime like the GATT and WTO were supposed to be, classic rent-seeking monopolies, as in patents, for basically protecting the monopoly interests of pharmaceutical and other firms. So this content is not free trade versus protectionism. It really is a model of globalization that has a lot less to do about trade per se in the WTO rules. I mean, the GATT and some of the other agreements relating to subsidies and actual trade customs issues in the WTO are really trade agreement terms. But a lot of the rest of it is a different, behind the borders largely, countries shall conform their laws or face limits on their actual trade rules that were imposed one size fits all. And that was basically sold as having great benefits that never materialized. So whatever your sort of ideological sense is of neoliberalism, good or bad, and the set of policies of creating various investor and intellectual property rights and deregulating in other sectors, constraining the role of government, separate from the ideological debate about that, the outcomes that were promised just didn't materialize. And in fact, perversely, in the context of the WTO, the countries that joined later, Vietnam, or joined sooner rather than later, but didn't follow a lot of the rules, China, did a lot better than the countries that were the strictest adherents to the entire neoliberal policy package, like Mexico, where growth is very slow and wages have declined, not increased, and a variety of the promises that were guaranteed for NAFTA, for that matter, prior to that, when Mexican administrations decided unilaterally to liberalize and to deregulate and to increase investor rights, it hasn't worked out for most Mexicans. So that all brings us to the what now, because the same kind of crisis of legitimacy in the WTO is also the problem of people in many countries realizing that they haven't gotten from this model of globalization and trade all the promised benefits, and then that begs the question, what do we do? And there is a caricature of some fight between it's the status quo, or it's Trump's nationalism, or it's autarky. And those are not our only three choices. There is a question of what the rules should be, depending on what goals you want. So just as a note, over at the WTO, the institution is not helping save itself. Instead of sort of an institutional system being designed for a real think of a step back and a real rethinking of the goals and therefore what the right rules are for purpose, the system is set up to basically replicate more of the same. So in the midst of a huge institutional crisis of its existing rules and its core functions of negotiation and enforcement, what's happening at the WTO? A block of countries that could not, through the official rules, get agreement to launch new negotiations on what they're calling digital trade, but is basically more regulatory handcuffs so that the signatory countries cannot regulate the big tech giants with respect to fundamental issues about consumer privacy, about monopoly and size, about discrimination through algorithms. All of these issues that could not get consensus from the WTO members, a handful of members went on the side and have sort of started a thing that they are kind of calling a WTO agreement, but not really, but it's negotiated in Geneva and sometimes in WTO headquarters, and looks like a sideways way to have rules that a bunch of key countries oppose who are WTO members, but is basically more of that same use of trade negotiations to limit regulation about things unrelated to trade. And there's a push on investment rules, same thing. It's an agenda that's been defeated over and over in different WTO rounds. But if you step back and think about what are the goals, and this is sort of where I'm going to leave off, I agree with Mark that the trade, politics, and policy in the US is permanently shifted. And also China's rise is a major part of that. But I think it's really unclear how that plays out with respect to the US and the WTO after the Trump administration. Because I think Lighthizer approach is not actually as fluky as it might appear, given the goals that increasingly are politically necessary for politicians of any stripe to be able to deliver conflict with the existing rules. So if you assume there's going to be a change and there's a Biden administration, and even if Biden is not focused on trade, for Biden to deliver on his core goals, the things that he's been touting, is going to require changes to the WTO rules. Some of the most non-trade things like subsidizing the post office to keep that public service vital, having an extended public option in healthcare, breaking up some of the big tech giants. Those are all in violation of various US commitments under the General Agreement on Trade and Services. And those are some of the core non-trade issues one can think of immediately that conflict. But if you think of the goals that any future president who is not Trump will focus on for climate, various of the policy tools you would want to use, for instance, distinguishing between different types of energy based on their environmental impact, as well as starting to internalize the costs of carbon, which inherently is going to have some deglobalizing effects and is going to end up with some kind of border disciplines on carbon externalization. those are all things that conflict with the current rules. So what are the goals? And theoretically, the goals need to be increasing the livelihood and economic well-being of people in countries around the world, environmental sustainability and planetary survival of the climate crisis. Those kind of mission-driven goals will not only require refiguring the dispute settlement system, where I do think there is an inherent conflict between getting the rules right and then how much you want to enforce them. And there is, I think, a sort of a structural problem of how those kind of big discussions get launched. So I just want to go back to where the GATT itself was started with the Bretton Woods Summit. What is the new Bretton Woods moment? Now, if you think back to the GATT, you know, a piece of history that I think probably a lot of us should know more about, I feel that way, is the original International Trade Organization, which was to be the third Bretton Woods institution with the IMF and the World Bank. It was tanked by the US Senate, but it was an organization much more designed for purpose than the GATT, which was the provisional tariff schedules. The ITO had explicit goals: full employment, well-working global markets and national markets, fair trade, and it had rules many decades ago with respect to dealing with competition policy and not having global monopolies. It connected to the International Labor Organization's nascent standards for labor rights. It dealt with currency issues and currency values. And that purpose-drawn set of rules conflicts, I would say, with the purposes behind what the current WTO rules are, which obviously have their conflicts with many of the goals we have. But if you think of the process of how the WTO rules were drawn, it was mainly for the goals of a lot of very large companies that found it interesting to have, for their own purposes, the global homogenization of standards, limits on standards, a ceiling on environmental and health standards, but no floor of decency in the global economy. Like we have federal law, states can go higher. There's no floor at the WTO. There's only a ceiling if standards, domestic standards, are too high. So some of that big structural thinking obviously needs to be revisited, but what is the trigger for a Bretton Woods type system? And then I believe that the enforcement issues actually flow from what the rules are. And just one note on the politics, which is the politics at the WTO is extremely tricky and shifting. So the Latin American countries shift to more conservative governments, with China rising as an even stronger force, with a very odd dynamic of many countries in the developing world who probably don't actually have do not have the same commercial interests as China backing standard positions of China in the WTO. And effectively, China is the guard of that bloc, but some of the members of the bloc's interests are different from China, is one of the geopolitical dynamic issues that's going to have to be sorted out at the WTO for there to be any discussion. And the big other issue out there is scope. And I will just leave it with this, which is traditionally civil society's approach on the WTO has been to get rid of the things that shouldn't be in a trade agreement that were the corporate agenda. So the intellectual property rules, monopolies in the free trade agreement, the services rules, the basically rules that go from objective to subjective. Why should there be a rule in a services trade agreement that simply forbids countries to regulate on the basis of size? That regulating on the basis of size, antitrust policy is needed for well-working markets. So the question is, if you were to remove many of those overreach issues, then what are the pieces needed to fix the trade part? And that is a fight that is going to have to play out, where I would just leave it by saying some of the price and anti-dumping theories of value inputs could play an interesting guide with respect to what actual commercial elements go into a price of a good in trade. So labor standards, currency, subsidies, and externalized environmental costs, what things stay out. And I will leave it there.
Thank you, Lori, for your insights on both the diagnosis and also the potential scenarios for the future. And now let me turn to Harlan Cohen.
All right. Well, thank you, Alvaro, and thank you also to Georgetown University Law Center and CAROLA, as well as all of those of you who are tuning in today. As others have said, it really is an honor to be a part of this panel and a pleasure to be with all of you. And I think that I'm coming in at the right moment here because I'm going to echo a lot of the same themes that Lori just raised, but perhaps with a slightly different spin or angle. I think for anybody who's listening to all the speakers today, it's fair to conclude that trade, the trading system, trading agreements are in a state of flux, and there are challenges coming from almost every direction. Obviously, many of those challenges have at their source policy disagreements, but I would suggest that this flux runs much deeper than policy disagreements, that in fact, what has frayed and what is fraying is actually our basic consensus on what trade agreements are for. I would start in thinking about all of this with a very simple question, right? Why do we have or pursue trade agreements? This may seem like a simplistic place to start, but I would suggest that in order to have any sort of coherent, stable, or legitimate trade policy, we're going to need to have some sort of answer to that question. I would also suggest that answering that question, right, what is trade law for, is going to be the way in which we determine how to balance various goals. It's going to be the way in which we determine how to fill gaps in the agreements. It's going to be the way in which we determine who has a say in trade agreements, who is going to be allowed to sit at the table in trade negotiations. But most of all, answering that question, right, what is trade law for, is necessary in order to explain why people should accept and support these agreements, right? We need to have some answer to this question in order to explain why people should see trade agreements generally or any particular trade agreement as good and worthy of support. Now, over time, we've obviously had different answers to this question, which all play a role at various points. We might say that trade agreements will serve our security interests. We might suggest that trade agreements will support friendly exchange and cooperation. We might suggest that trade agreements support stability and a rule-based system. But the meta-narrative, right, the broader story that we tell that pulls all of this together, right, the story that sort of explains all the different pieces has been, for the most part, at least for the last couple of decades, a story in which trade grows the overall pie, in which trade raises all boats. The basic story has been that everyone does better when trade barriers come down. Right. Now, this narrative is going to sound familiar from economics, right? It's based on basic economic principles with regard to comparative advantage, but it isn't an economic principle, right? It's a political narrative we tell. It's a political narrative we tell about to try to explain certain realities in the world. And as such, right, it papers over certain things in those realities that don't really work with that narrative. So putting aside for a moment questions about how we weigh growth, which is obviously the key to that story, against other state interests like national security or the environment, we know that as a matter of reality, states don't all enter into negotiations at the same level of development. And for example, developing states, when they enter into these trade agreements, they are basically agreeing to perhaps be put at a relative disadvantage for some period of time. They're basically allowing others to decide how fast they should grow, what sort of development is worthwhile. We also know that trade agreements are not abstract models, but are actually negotiated realities. And those negotiated realities, those negotiated agreements are going to favor some industries at the expense of others. But most of all, we know that trade agreements do nothing to guarantee that the gains from growth will be broadly shared, right? But the narrative, right, the grow the pie narrative has been that all of those concerns, right, even if we recognize them, those concerns could be dealt with after the gains from trade were secured, after growth was guaranteed. What the politics of the past few years suggest is that that narrative, right, that trade grows the overall pie, no longer rings true. Is no longer really acceptable as a justification. At the most basic level, I would suggest that the financial crisis and its aftermath demonstrated the emptiness of promises that the gains from trade would be widely shared. But the questions run much deeper, right? The growing the pie, raise all boats narrative assumes that all that really matters is that every state gain. It suggests that relative growth, that relative gain is relatively less important. Now, developing states have long pushed back on that assumption, right? Why should they be locked in a particular stage of development relative to other states? But with the rise of China and others, developed states too, most notably here in the United States, are asking those questions as well, right? They're asking, do we really not care who wins the competition for jobs or new industries? And finally, we have new policy issues on the table like AI, data, and the environment. They're raising questions whether growth, right, again, the key to that narrative, even should be the priority at all, right? As Lori was suggesting, right, trade agreements seem to be racing past fundamental questions about what people want from the good life, questions about the future of work, right, how data should be conceptualized and regulated, and whether in the face of climate change, growth, as opposed to, say, sustainability, is even a desirable goal. The result, though, of all of these narratives, I would suggest, is the same, right? Justifying trade agreements on the basis of the narrative that trade grows the overall pie are simply not viable, right? One interesting thing, if you think about the conversations you've heard over the past couple of years in an attempt to justify the various different kinds of trade developments that are out there, is that you really don't hear that grow the pie narrative much anymore, right? It seems to have moved from the center of justifications of these things to kind of the periphery. Now, what happens when you lose that single shared narrative? Well, I would suggest that in the absence of that sort of shared narrative, other stories about trade, other stories to justify trade are re-entering the fold and jockeying for position, from stories about making deals that are fair to protect the rights of workers, to stories about a zero-sum game in which the goal of trade agreements is to gain some advantage with regard to others, to stories about protecting national security. And depending on the particular deal or action that we're talking about, one or another of these stories might seem to dominate, right? So if we're talking about USMCA, we might hear a lot about how it's there, how the agreement guarantees fairer treatment for labor. If we're talking about the China Phase 1 deal or the revisions to the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement, you hear more arguments about securing better position for certain industries, perhaps for farmers. If you're talking about the recent actions against TikTok or WeChat, then obviously national security concerns are at the top of the agenda. But what we're missing is a broader narrative that can make sense of all of this, that can pull all of these things together. I would also suggest that to the extent to which we don't have a broader narrative, to the extent to which we are toggling between these different stories to justify these different actions, these agreements become much harder to actually judge, right? It becomes harder to figure out whether or not we like anything in these agreements, and that raises the risk of various actors taking the opportunity to get some sort of benefit from these deals at the expense of others. It raises the risk of corruption, right? So we should be concerned about the toggling between these different types of arguments. But what all of these competing narratives hint at, I would suggest, is that any new narrative, right? Any new narrative that's going to bring some coherence to all of this is going to have to be re-embedded within broader policy goals. The grow the pie narrative justified treating trade as something separate from other policy concerns. It justified a kind of two-step politics, right, in which trade would handle growth, right, and others would have to worry about distribution, competition policy, privacy, and the environment, usually at the domestic level. Bringing those kinds of concerns into trade agreements, right, something we've been doing for the last few decades, might help, but doing so maintains the illusion that those concerns are separate, right, and distinct from the growth concerns of the trade agreement. And they give trade lawyers basically the keys to the door, right? They basically allow trade lawyers to decide which concerns to allow in and under what circumstances. Creating a stable alternative narrative is instead going to require both a more open trade politics and rethinking trade's position in policy debates. Any new narrative, I think, is going to have to emerge organically from politics. We can't impose it. But to give an example of how one might play out here, you could take as a potential starting point a narrative built around each state's obligation to provide for its people's welfare, both individually and collectively. Such a narrative wouldn't question trade's power to help economies grow, but it would tie choices about the pace and scope of liberalization to domestic policy priorities. It would be domestic policy debates that would drive trade negotiations rather than trade negotiation that would create the space for domestic policy. This would require, and this is very complicated, work at two levels simultaneously, right? First, it would require embedding trade within broader debates about societal goals, right? So trade would has to be seen as a tool of those goals, not as a goal in itself. It should be seen as a concern to be weighed in policy discussions rather than something that weighs against them, a tool to produce growth within priorities that have already been worked out, a discipline to be applied to help negotiate cooperation with others rather than conflict. Right? It's questions about taxes, right? If you're thinking about redistribution, that has to be at the top of your agenda, about labor, about data, about environmental policy that need to be worked out first. And it's not only that trade agreements need to be negotiated with those aims in mind, but it might mean pushing trade from the driver's seat in international negotiations to the passenger seat, with agreements on taxes, on labor, on data, on the environment, using trade as a carrot rather than the other way around. But at the same time, trade agreements need to be opened up both to allow others to join the table and to make them more transparent and politically salient, right? People need to know why they care about trade agreements, why the balance that states strike matters, why they might matter if you care about data or the environment. This means building in mechanisms that they can mobilize around, right? So we've already heard about how USMCA creates some mechanism for labor to actually raise concerns, right? That might be a way not only to bring those concerns to the table, but actually to bring a different group of stakeholders into the area, onto the area of concern. You could also think about ways in which we might need to renegotiate subsidy policies, right? So if we're going to need to start to think about subsidies for environmental goods, right? This could be thought of not just as a way to bring that issue to the table, but to also make these trade agreements salient for those who care about the environment. Another idea on the table, Greg Schaefer has been the most prominent proponent of this, is some sort of social dumping duty, right? This would be a unilateral tariff, a bit like a safeguard that can be used to protect against illegal labor or environmental practices. Whether or not you like this particular policy, the beauty of this kind of idea is it would give other groups reasons to care about trade agreements regularly, not only when they're negotiated. But putting any particular policy prescription aside, the key is that we are at a moment for creative rethinking. Right? The normal science of trade law, right, built on this grow the pie narrative, is breaking down. We've been adding all sorts of epicycles to various agreements, right? Side agreements on labor and the environment, complex mechanisms in the USMCA, to try to meet the demands of various constituencies and interests who don't share that narrative. But what we really need now is a broader reappraisal. Rather than just adding agreements, we need to be thinking about overarching goals and where trade agreements fit within them. Look forward to the conversation about them.
Thank you very much, Harlan. So let me just highlight three themes that I saw were recurrent in the presentations very briefly. I thought the presentations really gave us a really wonderful overview of all these different aspects of international trade. It's as if we're trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle, and I think each of the different speakers gave us a piece of that puzzle. And so I think this is also really helpful for the audience to see the ways in which trade is changing and it's in flux, and the opportunities here for intervention, and also what we're probably gonna see in the years to come. So very briefly, one of the common themes that I heard in the presentations was that the international trade scene and assumptions have shifted, and that they are in flux, and that they will continue to be in flux, that in some ways there's no return to the previous consensus of the last 3 decades in some ways. Regardless of who wins the election in the US, it seems we're moving in a different direction. I think that's something that I got from the speakers, and that at the center of that change is a dissatisfaction with the way in which the system was operated. Whether it's a dissatisfaction of the US middle class, as Ambassador Jones noted in the case of NAFTA and some of the reasons for renegotiation, or whether it's a tension and a conflict between two great powers, US and China, and the way in which those are seeking to shape the regime, as in the presentation of Mark Wu, or the multilateral trade system in the telling of Lori Wallach. And so in her account, the problems of legitimacy at birth of that organization that we then saw unfold, and the problems that that has generated, first for developing and emerging countries, but now also for rich economies. And then finally, the contestation of the narratives or the normative assumptions that Harlan pointed out in ways that invite us to think about the reasons for having an international trade. So that's one thing. The second, very briefly, is that there seems to be an acknowledgement that this separation of the distinction between international trade rules on one hand and then domestic policy mechanisms to try to redress the potential negative consequences for losers that trade theory predicts will happen seems no longer so satisfactory. That there's a lot of work in trying to see how those international rules could be changed to have different distributional consequences, because there's a recognition that states have been unwilling or have faced lots of difficulties in trying to address those negative consequences domestically. And so that how you structure those international rules to begin with matters greatly. And thirdly, I think a broader question about the normative reasons and the goals that we seek to pursue with international trade, which seems also to suggest that a traditional distinction between trade as a more technical domain that can bracket politics and really important policy choices is no longer tenable. And so it's an invitation to think about politics more transparently and more clearly, figuring out who sits at the table of the negotiations, whose interests are represented, what consequences we might want to achieve. And so recognizing that there are different views and tensions, but at the same time, trying to give politics, so to speak, a good name, in that there's something important in trying to figure out these disagreements and being transparent about them. All right, so let me stop there and open it up to the audience. There's quite a few questions. And so let me start with a question by Geoff Garver, who's researcher at McGill University and part-time faculty at McGill and Concordia. And he was also a member of the Ecological Law and Governance Association. So he has a question for anyone who would like to respond, basically saying that modern trade and investment agreements promote remote ownership or remote decision-making and policy-making, and that they favor decisions and policies that are made far away, with little concern for local people and local ecosystems. So what reforms are needed to reverse and prevent these adverse land and resource grabs? Aren't we talking more of a major overhaul than incremental tweaking to stop this neocolonialism? So let me see if someone in the panel would like to respond to that question. Lori, go ahead.
Yes, there are certainly structural incentives to... Is everyone hearing that feedback, or is that just me? All right, now it's gone. There certainly are structural incentives to push away decision-making. And that, I think, is one of the sort of elements of the legitimacy crisis in the current system, which is when trade agreements were about trade, the GATT, for instance, and the rules only covered things you could literally drop on your foot, goods that went across borders. The notion that the decisions would be made and then locked in internationally with respect to border taxes on goods had a lot less individual concern or reasonable expectation for oversight than when trade agreement rules are determining things like what are non-discriminatory, so treating domestic and foreign goods and companies the same standards are with respect to natural resources management. For instance, NAFTA had a provision inserted, the proportionality clause, which was whacked in the revised NAFTA, a great improvement, that required once a country started exporting a natural resource, it could not cut off those exports, and it owed an obligation to the other countries based on a 3-year running average of the volume of the value of the exports to continue. So you started with water, that was it. You started lake water in Canada, very controversial, I know, which is why I'm mentioning it for this particular questioner, but also with oil, gas, et cetera. So the tar sands. So there were rules that basically also with respect to things that the general standard should just be don't discriminate with respect to food standards, with respect to very intimate decisions now on privacy and what we're going to do with big tech, where, I mean, the general position I would say that civil society has promoted, that I would say a lot of Democrats in Congress buy into, is that with respect to all of those issues, the proper place, the scope for the trade rules is just non-discrimination. That you can't impose one size fits all of these subjective rules without inherently undermining democratic accountability. And that gets to the scope issue. I mean, you can either have more open structures, as Harlan said, and more inclusiveness, and have the rules be broad but different. And maybe the body where the rules are made is focused on, is the center of the other goals. So it's not a trade discussion, but it's a discussion about the other issues. And obviously trade will inherently become one of the tools that are used to implement those goals. Or you can have the trade rules whacked way back to what's really about trade and get rid of all of these additional rules that were imposed. That certainly would help the legitimacy crisis in the WTO vis-a-vis a lot of the member countries. But you can't really have legitimacy of one-size-fits-all rules on subjective matters imposed through secretive negotiations. And so that distance issue, I mean, one of the most clever things ever said was by a Canadian, Maud Barlow of the Council of Canadians, called it a slow motion coup d'etat via trade agreement to democratic decision-making. Because slowly the trade agreements were rolling into all of these behind the borders issues.
Okay, thank you, Lori. I saw that Harlan and Mark wanted to jump in on this question.
Okay, so I would just add a couple of things. So in thinking about this question about remote ownership, I mean, where I would start is trying to think about what areas of law, what legal regimes are really the ones that encourage that. And the first things that would come to mind would be tax policy, which might encourage you to locate in different countries, regardless of where you may have your operations. It might be corporate law, which may allow you to basically structure your companies in various particular ways. It might be data policies that allow you the easy transfer of data between different places. All of those things are things that we should be thinking about very carefully when we're concerned about questions about remote ownership, but thinking about in their own right, what dividing trade from all of these other areas has done, right, is it allows trade agreements to move ahead, right, to rush forward, right, on all of these kinds of questions, or with implications for all of these questions, without giving anyone an opportunity to work those things out, right? And as you can see from everything we were talking about here, it is very hard to talk about the gains of trade without thinking about where the taxes from that trade actually go. It's very hard to think about the role of data without first thinking about how are we conceptualizing data? Is it about privacy? Is it about security? Is it about supply chains? Is it about competitiveness? What we need to do is find a way to actually put the brakes on these trade agreements while we work out these questions themselves, and then adapt the trade rules to what we've decided with regard to these broader questions.
Thank you, Harlan. Mark?
Sorry, a bit of technical difficulty there. I'm muting. I just wanted to speak specifically to the ecological part of Dr. Carver's question. So the problem here is twofold, right? One is there's a lag. So certainly once you negotiate the agreement, then it's done, right? The only chance you have to block it is at the stage of ratification and implementation and so forth. But then it's a done deal. And at that point, we're only speculating about what type of ecological consequences are to come, but we don't quite know what those are. And so that's the first issue here, right? It's not like A will directly lead to B. It's a question of A happens and then we don't know what B will be, and there's a range, right? And so then in terms of then dealing with those consequences, we're counting on a mechanism that requires governments to monitor other governments. And so civil society, or even if we think about specific, say, indigenous groups within Latin America, which are affected by these ecological patterns, right? They have to work through their governments. And we have certain political economy effects, and particularly where governments are concerned about near-term impacts for their economies and attracting foreign investment and so forth. Those civil society groups may find themselves very much at a disadvantage in order to mobilize those types of resources. So I think if you look at both the lag as well as the fact that this is all worked through domestic political economy, right, that in essence is the structural problem here. And so then the destruction happens, and once the destruction happens, whether you've cut down a forest or whether you've pulled or certain minerals out of the ground and so forth, the damage is done. And so what we need to do is to find a mechanism that incentivizes people to prevent that from happening in the first place. Because right now we have an ex post system where the incentives don't align, and there's not necessarily clear there are consequences after the fact, and those consequences after the fact don't necessarily fall on the political actors who made them to begin with. So I think one possible way that's been discussed is, of course, to put in automatic sunsets, whether that's in the international treaty or in the domestic law itself, that says if X happens in an ecological perspective, the trade treaty, right, effectively terminates. And I think that's the type of approach we're going to have to do in order to align with these types of issues if we want to deal with that lag, because otherwise that lag is the essence of the structural problem on the ecological side. Whether or not there's the political will to put that in place, that's a different question.
Okay, so let me, Ambassador Jones, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just very briefly. In addition to all the practitioners' work, I think a strong attention to the politics in every country is very, very important, because I think that's going to be very volatile. We have in the USMCA, what Mark was just talking about, a review process every 6 years, and then it closes at 16 years, where we can look at those issues. I think two very big issues for the United States is one, the climate issue, the environmental issues, and number two, I think we have to look at our concept of trade adjustment assistance as we had before in trade agreements, and make sure that they are meeting the demands and the voids of the current economy, and that we're training people for jobs of the future, not of the past. So I think that's a very important thing. We ought to gear toward that every 6-year review to deal with those issues.
Thank you. Let me move to the second question. This is from Michael Gadbo, a professor at Georgetown Law. And so he's saying the Trump administration seems to have done something truly revolutionary for the political economy of trade by gaining support for the revised NAFTA from US labor. The incorporation of labor rights into trade agreements have been controversial for decades, but those changes have not only been absorbed, but as Mark Wu has said, they're now taken for granted going forward. My question is, why did it take so long? And if we had made these changes sooner, would we be facing the same backlash against globalization that we face today? So who would like to answer that question?
I have some strong views on that question.
Go ahead, Lori.
Yes, if you could, I will turn my head sideways so you can see my smashed in forehead from banging against walls of about 25 years of talking about these issues and getting nowhere. And the answer is a power question. I mean, all joking aside, the question is a power question. So the ultimate sort of strategy of the organizing and political work that I do when I take off my trade wonk lawyer hat, was to make it politically impossible to continue the current regime. And as a practical matter, if you think about this in the US, that means the House, because election and accountability is injected every 2 years. It's a dose that you can administer more quickly than the 6 years of the Senate. You have to hold accountable and remove some members of Congress who have voted wrong against their constituents' own interests, and you need to make clear that they lost their seats because they, excuse my language, but screwed their own constituents on trade. And that is hard work. That is educating people about what the rules are, what the outcomes are, and what the alternatives are to get the benefits of trade without necessarily having the set of rules that's caused the damage. And so the power dynamic has shifted over time. And Trump basically saw a wave, and he paddled his surfboard to the top of it and cruised it right through Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. But he did not create the wave. The wave was created by a lot of people understanding the gap between what they were promised for this model and what happened to them in their own lives. And they're mad. And Trump has identified, as did Bernie Sanders, and Senator Warren, real objective data. I mean, 1 million jobs are certified as lost to NAFTA under the Trade Justice Assistance Program of the Department of Labor. Whole communities got clobbered, flattened by our China Permanent Normal Trade Relations WTO accession experiment. It's not says any activist group, but says Professor Autor and research team. So those lived experiences have really transformed the political dynamics. And the question about whether it would have changed if it had happened earlier is, of course, an interesting question. But the forward-looking question to me is the more important one, which is, yes, some of these things are taken for granted. But what was really said loud and clear is that the NAFTA revision was certainly what was necessary to get support for that. But that isn't the model going forward. And Congress, Democrats in Congress, that majority that made it possible to pass it, made that clear. Because, from the perspective of the sort of political economy of it, the existing NAFTA was like in the 12th rung below hell. And the revision brought it up to the crust and slightly above. But it is not heavenly. And so just very quickly, if you look at the balance, the investor state dispute settlement system, which is one of those incentives for remote ownership and for giving companies a thumb on the scale, the intellectual property extreme rules for medicines, and the loss of control over natural resources, those things were partially or totally whacked out of the old NAFTA. So that is a step in the right direction. As we've heard, tighter labor standards were added, some real enforcement potential, but also just the concept of a rule of origin that looks at wages. It's not going to be effective the way it's written, but conceptually, that takes into account the notion that a goal is to raise wages and there's a tool for it, and the tighter rules of origin to make sure that the countries that signed up get the benefits if they follow the rules. But then you look at that agreement and they added really bad new digital rules that limit regulatory authority, even for non-discriminatory policies for big tech, and new limits on how we make regulatory policies, the good regulatory practices. So if you look forward and you want to see a future agreement, it's not going to get through Congress, and this is just parochial US, unless it builds on the standard for fixing a bad agreement that was doing ongoing damage is not the same for a new agreement from scratch. And so, the real question is, will those lessons be learned? Because there is a strong set of commercial interests that are dying to go back to the old model, who think that they can change the politics the way that labor and environmental and consumer groups have, and hope to go back to agreements that are captured for their interests.
Right. If someone else wants to take a crack at that response, let's do that. Otherwise, let me move to the next question. Okay, so this is Mara Lee, a question for Harlan. On what basis do you say that the narrative of trade is good for growth no longer rings true given the US polling? This is from Gallup. America's broad view of trade is the most positive it's been in more than a quarter century. As of February 2019, nearly 3 in 4 US adults believe trade represents an opportunity for economic growth through increased US exports. Barely 1 in 5 see trade as more of a threat to the economy from foreign imports. The Biden administration says negotiating a new trade agreement will not be a priority, but how do you think Biden would approach other countries' desires to tax internet giants' revenue rather than profits, and do you think he would use Section 301 tariffs to punish those who resort to DST? Can a negotiated settlement avoid a tariff showdown?
Thanks. So I think this is an important question, right? I've followed this polling as well, and I've tried to think about what it might mean. I'm not a pollster. I'm not going to be able to break down exactly what's going on here, and anything I say about this is purely speculative. It's hard to figure out, I think, how much of the current polling in favor of trade is really a reaction to the Trump administration and the way in which it has engaged in trade policy as opposed to actually being about trade itself, right? I think we need to know a lot more to know whether this goes to actual preferences as opposed to broader political concerns. But I also think the question, it might not be right, and here I could be wrong about this, but it might not be right to look at the overall population. What you want to really look at are marginal voters who matter in these particular elections. And there is some evidence. I saw a recent study by Christoph Pelk, for example, that looks at areas where trade adjustment assistance is being provided and where it's not, and it shows that, right, it seems to be that where people are getting some of the benefit of trade through trade adjustment assistance, right, you see support for trade agreements where they're not, where they no longer are, that support has gone away. If you think about it in those terms, what we're really asking is, right, are enough of the people who are losing in the deal with regard to trade, are enough of them feeling like they're getting something back in return in order to tip the balances in these various different elections. But again, I'm not a pollster, so I don't want to try to figure that out too deeply. In terms of the broader question about thinking about a tax on internet giants, on a digital tax, I think I think this is where it's important that everyone starts to re-embed these questions within their own policies, right? So I think that, I don't know what the Biden administration will do here with regard to others' policies on this, but I think it would be helpful for everyone, and I think there is some thinking like this within the Biden campaign, to actually think about what our policies collectively should be with regard to these digital internet giants first, before figuring out how we want to actually think about the various different trade mechanisms that are applied to them. So how we react to others applying these sorts of taxes really should start with what sorts of taxes, what sorts of policies would we want to apply to them ourselves. I think that would be a better basis both for our own policy and for negotiations that might go forward.
Great, thank you. So let me ask the last question. This is by Professor Charles Sabel from Columbia Law School. Modern trade agreements will have to be openly negotiated, monitored in operation, and adjustment as needed. They will almost be, by definition, have to agree sector by sector and focus on questions of regulatory equivalence, for example, on food safety, environmental protection, and so on, and ongoing verification of mutual reliability in assuring this. How, given the breakdowns in negotiation and the consensus rules of the WTO, do you imagine such agreements as emerging, perhaps on a pilot basis and legitimated? Mark, go ahead.
If I may take a first crack at it, I'm sure others may have something to say. I think the first statement in the question is a relatively optimistic statement about where we may be headed. And I think if you listen to what all of my fellow panelists have commented here, is there is a set of interests that very much does not want to do that, and that is just waiting to ride out this way. It sort of thinks politics goes in waves, and right now trade is having its moment, but in another time, right? Healthcare, or perhaps right, climate policy, something else is going to take the spotlight. And when that happens, they're hoping to go back to the old way. But I think the second part of this statement is exactly right. It may very well be equivalence. It may very well be sector by sector and so on and so forth. So the possibility that I want to hold out is I think we may see more of these types of executive agreements along the lines of what the US-Japan digital agreement was done. That's to say, whether it's trade ministries, the Prime Minister's office, or in the US case, right, the executive branch, unilaterally working through these sector agreements, arguing they fall within the bounds of what's been the delegated authority. And the same could hold true with, say, the European Commissions and so forth. I think that's one possible model. But that's not necessarily the optimistic model that I think Professor Sable is looking towards. But that's certainly the one that we see moving along as opposed to these big mega deals. I think the other approach that we could see is what we've seen with a GDPR in the European Union, right, where a country, right, basically takes its standards, embeds it into domestic law, and then uses the weight of its own domestic markets, right, to push that forward. And again, that doesn't require any form of open negotiation or anything with civil society in another country. It's I'm important, you've got to deal with me. Here's my standard, take it or leave it. And we're seeing, right, people do this on multiple fronts. And I think that may be the world that we're moving towards. It is sector by sector, it is equivalence oriented, but it's not necessarily the optimistic one. And then the question for civil society is, what do you do to shine the spotlight on that in that type of world? So I'll leave it. I think I may provoke some of my fellow panelists to add in or perhaps disagree with that viewpoint.
So let me invite the other panelists, if you want to leave the audience with a concluding thought, this will be the moment since we've reached the end of our session. And so whether it's, in answer to this question or sort of complementing or debating what Mark just said, or you want to address, another theme from the conversation, this will be a good moment to do it before we say goodbye.
Well, I think this isn't going to be as together as a concluding statement, but to answer the question about equivalence, I think that I think Mark is spot on about sort of pointing out the dynamic. I would raise two things that are game changers that may thwart the restoration of trade team status quo, which are the climate crisis for sure, and not just the fact that the countries that are going ahead are at some point going to want to do something to do some kind of an offset for their internalization of carbon and what that's going to mean for long distance shipping and a lot of the supply chains we've set up, but also the COVID-19 experience, where in a lot of rich countries, highly educated people are suddenly having a personal experience of the downside of hyperglobalization. They haven't gotten their job offshore, but they can't get, and their country can't make the core things that they need. And shortages of things like medicines that have been bubbling along are coming to the fore and being discussed. So that for the sort of political dynamic is, I think, a big structural set of countervailing phenomenon. That said, I think Mark is right vis-a-vis, it's not a likely scenario of live negotiated agreements of cooperation, and particularly increasingly, I would say, at least in the US Congress, which is my familiar haunt, there's more awareness of the downsides of the notion of equivalence versus something more like what Mark has described, where big players set standards, and if you want into that market, you have to meet the standards, not equivalent to. Now, you still have to do conformity assessment to see if you've met the standards. But the dynamic where right now the US is under equivalent standards of the WTO sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, accepting imports of meat from 40 countries whose inspection systems do not satisfy US safety standards, is the kind of issue. And then the WTO rules as illegal the country of origin label, so you could be an informed consumer. Those are the kinds of issues that create the legitimacy crisis in the first instance. So I suspect Mark's notion of there being perhaps a US standard, an EU standard, and a China standard, and the need to produce to them, which is done in food right now. There is the WTO equivalent standard, and then Japan and Europe have basically set their own standards and said you have to meet to these standards, and slaughterhouses around the world do it. I think that that is a more likely scenario going forward. But what it doesn't take into account is the areas that are clearly transboundary, like data flows and climate, which brings us right back to the circle of the scope problem.
Thanks, Lori. Let me see if Ambassador Jones or Harlan want to have a word. Go ahead, Harlan.
I'll just add one thing. So I've been part of a couple of high-level conversations in the last couple of weeks with general international lawyers where it's been sort of suggested, it's been implied that trade law is boring and arcane. Now, I don't think there's anything boring or arcane about the conversation we're having here, but I think this goes to this question, this larger point about raising the political salience of these issues, right? To the extent to which we care about these issues, to the extent to which we want to see reform along any of these various lines, we're going to have to work to help people understand why these issues matter to them, why these issues are important to them, and why the things that they care about are inextricably intertwined with what might have been shown to them, what might have been sort of proclaimed to them as boring and arcane.
And I would just add another point. I think it all depends on our worldview, our view of the world. When I was in Congress and on the trade subcommittee my entire career there, of Ways and Means, we started trade agreements on the basis that this was an opportunity. Now, when you start trade agreements, it's something to be avoided. It's a danger. So I think if we have the worldview of how we fit into the world, that's going to change the mindset. And I think the best way to do that is in the climate issues, because that affects the whole world. So I think that's going to be our future.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, we've reached the end of our session. Time really flew, and I would love to continue here talking to all of you and asking you questions. But we're really delighted that you had the opportunity to join us, and we're thankful for your insights. Before we go, I just want to remind our audience that we have a session on Thursday on career paths in international trade law. Thanks to our speakers again for joining us today, and hopefully we'll be able to get you back at some other point in another one of our events. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.